Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Becoming a Birder, Part 4, Getting the Most Out of Merlin, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Take it away, Kristina.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your busy lives and busy days to learn about some of the natural world and one of our lovely technology apps that we can use to give us a new perspective and get us in touch with it. Before I roll into this webinar, I actually wanted to take a moment outside of this because as the calendar rolled up to this date, I remembered what day it was. And today is indeed September 11th. And so I think in the same way that with birding, it's sort of about taking a minute and taking a pause from our lives to connect with nature in that same sort of respect for that, I just actually wanted to hold a moment of silence before we started our webinar here. 9/11 means a lot of different things for different folks all around the world. And regardless of what it is for you, I think that it's really important that we take time in our lives for grief and for loss on so many different levels and scales, personal or otherwise. I know for myself, just a couple days after this would be my brother's birthday. He passed away when we were kids, and I didn't even realize it, but he would have been 37 this year, which blows my mind. Yeah, so a little bit out of our normal regime, I know, and if you're just joining in, that's okay. You can catch up to us in a second. We're still going to do birding, I promise. But I just, in recognition of the day that it is, I think it would be great to just take a quick pause and yeah, maybe reflect on some loved ones that are with us or far away or waiting for us on the other side. Thank you, everyone, for observing that with me. I appreciate the time. And yeah, I hope, even after this webinar, you have a moment to yourself or take a walk or even just go breathe, go listen to some birds, right? We all need to connect to that in lots of different ways as our world moves so fast and so busy around us. So for those who have followed along with us already, we are on part 4. So I just wanted to do a quick pause, sort of as an invitation for anyone who might have downloaded the Merlin app in our part 3, but hasn't quite got settled in yet, or for anyone who is just joining us now. If you already have the app on your phone, that's great. If you want to put it on now and kind of follow along with some of the things we're going to go to, by all means, that is awesome. Also, as always, you are not required to. You can happily just kind of follow along. One of the great things about these being recorded is that you can go back and kind of look at some of these features at your own pace later on. But if you wanted to do it, that's what you want to go look up. Would be just look up Merlin and bird, and you'll find it pretty quick. So yeah, we are on part 4 of our birding adventure. For anyone who's been following along, you'll know that I have not yet quite self-identified as a birder. I think it's we're getting over my social stigmatism of it, of kind of that collector's mindset that I find kind of pervades it in a lot of our culture or pop culture version of birders anyways. I always think about like the cartoon guy of like the one with the binoculars and he's looking over in his neighbor's yard or something like that. And that is all good too, right? But I just think that really birds are this like beautiful, fascinating connector, indicator of our environment. And so one of the most important skills that we can learn to hone is just to pay attention, right? If that's the only thing you get out of this, hour that we spend together, even if it's not how to find all these fun, cool things on the app, even if it's just learning to hone some new skills, this is the best way that we can be spending our time together. So the Merlin app, just a little bit of a reminder for everyone, was created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I'm normally not one for mission statements because they are, or should, let me rephrase that. I normally don't go looking for mission statements because that's usually sort of some internal work, but I realize that often it does sort of reflect outwardly too. And I just appreciate theirs so much. So we're going to reflect the Cornell Ornithology Lab's mission statement today, and that our goal is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds and nature. So those are what we're going to aim for. And as always, I can't help but make a good joke out of something. So Merlin was in fact named after its wizardry skills, not for the raptor bird. And my favorite version of Merlin is from The Sword and the Stone, the Disney one. I watched it so many times as a kid. And so I like the idea that it is Merlin the wizard who's going to lead us through all these new skills. So again, if you're jumping in today, or if you've got the app on but you haven't quite got things set up yet, the first thing you need to do, is you need to go into your settings and you need to get yourself a bird pack. You can think about it like a deck of baseball cards. This is going to have your stats, your descriptions, your calls, and your images of your respective species. You can do it by region. If you're going traveling, you can find other places in the world. If you got the space on your phone and you're from North America, I would just or if you're from the South, obviously get the Mexico one as well. But really just get the whole continental one. Then once you have it, you can always it will naturally narrow down for the region that you're in. So you don't have to have all of the hundreds of birds at once. It'll kind of zoom in for the region that you're at, which is really the kind of the most beautiful, important part of it. So step one, make sure that you've got your bird pack downloaded. And once you're there, this is kind of going to be that opening up screen that we get to. And last time, I couldn't believe it when I went to do this. I thought I was going to cover all of this in one, but the only feature we made it through was the Explore feature. There were so many cool things in there, different ways of thinking about grouping birds, of linking that into some of the skills we already developed. So today, we're going to jump right into the photo identification, wizardry, magical powers that are Merlin. So when you click on that photo icon, the first screen that's going to pop up is the one on the left here. We're going to kind of walk through the steps that Merlin has you do. And really, it's you could take a photo in the moment, but really I find it's easier if you are watching a bird, or even if you have some nice photos that you took in the past, you can always upload them to your phone or onto your computer. And then so what you're going to do is you're going to zoom in onto the bird that you have. And this is the same thing before when we were thinking about trying to identify birds. The true power of Merlin is the scope of information that it's powered by through the citizen science of eBird, and we're going to come back to that. That's a really important thing to flag. But when we're thinking about it, all you really need to start with is some amount of details of shape and location and time of year, right? And that is how Merlin narrows down what it's working with. So first you give it the shape, which is your photo. Then the next phase is the middle one that it brings you to. So that middle screenshot, is a location. So you can already tell this is a red-tailed hawk. That's what it gives a feedback for on the right side. So I grew up in southern Saskatchewan and used to see all sorts of red-tailed hawks. So I went and picked as if it was summer and I was back home, and that was how it helped narrow down which bird I thought I was seeing. Now, a fun thing I wanted to point out about the red-tailed hawk, that because we usually talk about them with their common names, not with their Latin names, but Latin names are this really fun window, both, I guess, into history and preference and things like that. And so if you look at the Latin name of the red-tailed hawk, it's Buteo jamaicensis, which my Latin is a little dreadful right now. But yeah, we're talking about it being named after Jamaica. And I don't know about you, but I don't really associate hawks or red-tailed hawks with Jamaica specifically. But this is one of those fun things where you can see how quote unquote discovery, or at least European discovery, gets linked into history. So the first red-tailed hawk from North America that was seen was found and shot on an expedition way back in 1781 by a guy named Johann Fried Gmelin. So that was when it was first described, and the name hasn't changed, a few hundred years later. So it's still a Jamaican hawk, which I think is kind of funny. And so we talked about this is how the app is identifying. I said it has to do with time of year and shape. And I just want to bring this back to, these are in part one, when we first started this, facing our fear of birders. These are the very basic skills that we started honing, the idea of silhouettes and body structure. And that is the exact same features that the app is using to do it for you. So that AI is being trained on the exact same skills that we started building ourselves. So we go back and think about these 4 groups of raptors, or really 3. Right, we can start thinking about some of those features of how in the world did the AI know that this was a hawk and not an eagle or a falcon, right? So if we think about that eagle just for a second again, let's go back to this, right? They have a wide wing structure. They have definitive shape between you could say fingers, right, between those feathers. And if we look at our photo of the red-tailed hawk, well, that's kind of the same too, right? Both of those are present. So let's look at some of the other features, right? If you look at the tail of our eagle, it's almost more diamond shaped versus if we look at the buteo, which is our genus that the red-tailed hawk falls under. Now we can start seeing some differences between them. So, because right, there's no scale on our photo of saying, well, the bird was this big, so it must have been an eagle, right? And so when we're thinking about shape size, we can start to think about some of those characteristics that we can see even if it's not a great photo. These are the same skills you're going to use if you're like looking up in the sky and the sun is half blinding you, but you can just kind of make out the silhouette. These are the exact same key features that you're going to use. So it works whether or not we're building this into the app, either way. So let's think about what's the difference between an eagle and a hawk, because I feel like those are the two that are most commonly mistaken. And obviously, once you get closer, if it's got that nice white bald head, you've got a bald eagle. But things like size are really hard to tell from far away. And so that silhouette of the hawk, you can see that instead of having the fingers, those feather fingers are slightly less defined. And also you can see that just generally the shape around the edges is more rounded. Second part is let's look at the tail, right? So that tail is less of a diamond shape and has more of a flat line along the bottom, kind of just more evenly rounded. And then, so those are the two that most likely would mix up in that way. And then we could also potentially mix up the two different types of hawks. So when we think about hawks, we actually split them into two different groups. So there's the buteo hawks and the accipiter hawks. And that's both based off of their body shape and size and also their livelihoods. So the red-tailed hawk, the buteo, we would find that one in more so open landscapes, whereas the accipiter is more of a forest hawk. So that one is going to be needing to dive, dodge, dip, dive, dodge. Anyone's ever seen that ball? Dodgeball. So we can actually see that reflected in their body shape. So the tail, the red-tailed hawk tail, it's designed more for soaring and having good control and steerage that way. Whereas that longer tail of the accipiter, that's for those really sharp banks that they need to make in order to weave in and out of treed areas. And again, another cue of all you could see was the silhouette. When we're looking at the wing shape of the accipiter hawks, they tend to have a bit more of that bend in there. They're not quite as straight. And then just behavior-wise, right? So we're looking for more of those soaring features versus having to flap more often. And then the falcon, lastly, just to include him, not to leave the little one out. Obviously, it's going to be the smallest of these four when we see it, so that helps. But another one is just that their wings are kind of more boomerang shaped, right? So they have much more of an angle, and that's right. Think about that compared to that nice long swoop of the hawk or of the eagle, right? So look at that. We're already starting to hone in on some pretty great skills to think about, which raptor are we seeing? And the most important thing about learning, I think, identification, there's the I've been to all 50 states, I've seen all these things. There's that type of just being able to knock something off a list. But the value to me of being able to identify something is to be able to tie it into why is it like that and how does that fit into its life? Right? It's the story behind it that is way more cool than just saying, hawks have small feathered wings and eagles have open feathered wings, right? There's nothing in my brain gets excited when I talk about the distance between the feathers, unless I know why there's distance between the feathers. All right, so our red-tailed hawk is, and we talked about this again before, but I want to tie in a few other things. So the red-tailed hawk is one of the most common hawks you'll see all across North America. Huge, huge range. And while you've probably seen one, and you might have not known you've seen one, you might have guessed it was a hawk, but you might have been seeing even a couple different hawks, and you're like, I wonder what kind those are. And the reality is that they could have been both the same species. So even though they have such a massive range, and they can all genetically interbreed, there's 14 different subspecies. And that means that they actually have lots of they look quite differently within those different subspecies. So if you go in Merlin, right, when you're trying to figure out, does this bird match the bird that I've just seen, it actually gives you different examples. So you can swipe through and see different examples of that species, different colorations for different regions, right, getting a better idea. So like in the prairies where I grew up, we had a lighter subspecies that was sometimes called Critter's hawk. It's really white, kind of washed out. Then there's also Harlan's hawk, which you find more so kind of like along Alaska, and that was a really dark color morph, probably the darkest and really dark everywhere, sort of like the one you would see on the left there. And then there's also different ranges in between, covering that whole region. And it kind of makes sense, that you would end up with genetic diversity that would sort of split off and form that, and then also just matching its environment, right? Prairies versus forested places, being light or dark has different advantages. But this, I'm going to throw in 2 more levels of complexity of this that make it more confusing, because it's not just easy to be like, oh, it's light, therefore it must be this subspecies. No. The hawks would never, they would never make it that simple for us. What I mean by that is that there are different color phases based on age as well as based on subspecies. So what I mean by that is this is an Harlan's hawk. So this is one of those western ones that sort of going northward Alaska that tends to be darker. And you can see as he is showing his wing here as an example, it's quite a mottled sort of streaked look. So that's what we call an intermediate color morph. So it's still the same subspecies, but it actually has different categories of what that color could be. And just to make it more complicated, the different color morphs then are different depending on their age. So tables are less exciting, they're less sexy, but they're more helpful for kind of visualizing this. So what I mean is that for the one subspecies, if we just talk about the Harlan's hawk, it has 2 color morphs that all still fit in the same subspecies. The dark morph, which is maybe the more recognizable one, pretty much all more brownish, and then also the intermediate morph. So these are still the same subspecies, they're not genetically different, or not so much that we split them up again. So we have color morph, and then we have age. And so within those juvenile and adult age brackets, you can also generally change the colors that you're seeing. And so you can have, this is what I'm saying, where things get confusing. You can have a juvenile intermediate morph sitting beside a juvenile, well, in this case it would be a marlin, but you could put it beside a juvenile prairie one, and they would look the same, even though they're not the same subspecies. And again, sometimes they do overlap. And as with subspecies, if they do overlap, they can interbreed, which is why subspecies is always one of the most confusing and sometimes frustrating things in biology. You're like, do we have, it's the classic war between groupers and splitters. That's what we used to call this when we were in school, or even just trains of thought. Some people really love to just split it. How do we make that as unique as possible? And everyone else wants to group it. And whether we call something a species or a subspecies, I feel like is the longest war between groupers and splitters and behavior trends. But now I'm just being finicky about things that I think are funny in biology. And the last thing I want to talk about with red-tailed hawks and color morphs, and I realize I maybe just confused you more than anything, but is that we call them red-tailed hawks. And I know you probably didn't have time to read all these details here, but if you read this whole first one about Harlan's hawk, you won't find red anywhere on a Harlan hawk. However, if we go to the western red-tailed hawk, then these guys finally have, so that subspecies actually has the typical red tail, or the orangish hues that we would identify it as. And so I realize I've started with something that's layers of color and complexity. The reality is that with the skills that you have in beginning your birding journey, you are going to be able to tell that it's a red-tailed hawk. Do you need to be able to tell which of the 14 subspecies it is? Maybe over time, if that's something of interest to you. But the thing I guess I'm trying to reaffirm with this is that variability is okay. It's okay that something's not going to look the first time the way you see it the next time. And it's fun. It's fun getting to guess whether you think you're seeing a juvenile, or maybe you've got a visitor from another part of the country that's in your neck of the woods. So again, birding can be really intimidating, but don't overstress. Just like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. You've got this. Just hold on to the core basics, and you're going to start adding on skills more at a time. And you'll remember a few of the things from this. And the next time you're out looking at a hawk sitting on a power line, you're like, hey, I think I know that that's a juvenile. It'll be very exciting. Oh, and this is the last thing. So this is one of the photos that they also have as like that you can flip through when you're looking at red-tailed hawk. And I don't know if you noticed it on the first time around, or whether you really kind of honed in on it, but no, this red-winged blackburn is not trying to land on the hawk. It's actually mobbing it. So it's when little birds will attack larger birds, usually birds of prey or predators, but not necessarily even just birds that are kind of in their turf. So what is going on there? Essentially, it often happens during sort of springtime, especially during nesting, when those other birds might be coming in for a snack, like this red-tailed hawk here getting chased away by some brewer's blackbirds. And so communal birds, or even just birds that mated pairs, if a hawk gets into their territory, they will 100% go after it, even though that hawk is really a predator of those birds. Or if the hawk can get it, it will 100% go snatch out of the air. But the reality is that those birds are, while they're smaller and not as strong, they're more agile. And so it's this interesting power play that comes into play in the sky. If you've ever had the chance to see it, I used to grow up watching this between swallows and hawks in the prairies. We had a lot of bank swallows and barn swallows too. And swallows live in these big communal groups. And if one mated pair like sees something that it doesn't like, they do out an alarm call, and then like so many family groups come and just pick away at them. And you might think it's unfair, but it's kind of an interesting one, right? It's who is the aggressor? Is it the predator that came in? Is it the ones that defended themselves? If you backtrack, the predator is probably just trying to feed its own young in its own nest. It's never ever a simple or a fair fight when it comes to nature. But all right, we'll keep moving along. So let's say that you're like, hey, I'm not a wildlife photographer. I don't take beautiful sweeping photos of red-tailed hawks floating through the sky majestically. My photos look like this. And actually, that's not that it's a terrible photo. But let's be honest, lots of times when we see birds, they are far away. Sometimes they're kind of clustered together. You're not even sure, are there different species in there? Is it all just one species? And so we're going to put Merlin to the test. How does Merlin do when it comes to things like this? But the first thing I want to say is that while we're going to show the skills that Merlin has, I always want you to rely on the skills that you have yourself. And what I mean by that is that for anyone who was here for part 2, and we'll do a little review of it today, is that the background information I'm going to give you for this photo is that it is winter time and that we are on the ocean. And that they look a little duckish, don't they, right? If you were here for part 2, the Mighty Ducks. The first thing we do when we see anything that looks mildly like a duck is we play the game, where is the white? It gets rid of all these complications of, does it have an iridescent this, or does it have an orange or reddish yellow that? Nope, get rid of all those details, doesn't matter. When it comes to ducks, we think about the world in black and white. The reason is because white is the most distinguished pattern that we can see from far away. Contrast is where it's at, right? And so these are the ducks, if you remember. These are the most common larger sea ducks that we would be able to see. And so already, without using Merlin and this very kind of far away photo, we should be able to start narrowing down who we think this raft of ducks might be. I know what you guys can see. I can see mostly black bodies and some white dots on them. So to me, it should be either some combination of those 3 scoters in the middle, scoters in the middle. That's who I'm anticipating this to be. And that's all I had to know was black and white. Where can we start off? Okay, so let's see what Merlin can do, right? So again, you zoom in on the photo. You need to give it a date and a location. So I said that this was on the coast around December. And look at what Merlin gives us. Well, actually, none of those look anything like what's sitting there in the ocean. It gave us a sandpiper, a snow goose, and a black tern. Whoops, maybe the wizard's spell didn't quite work this time. Well, we also didn't feed it the best information. So let's try again. Let's zoom in a little bit more and see what we can get. Now we've zoomed in, and not only can we see more for ourselves, but look at how much better Merlin is starting to do. So Merlin is being like, okay, it's not a sandpiper. You've got some sort of duck, and it's got some white spots on it, right? So we're getting closer. And from you and I, what can we really see now in this photo? We can see, so we've got a distinct white patch on the neck, and we've got the orange beak. All of them are facing away from us. So getting a view of the front, and maybe a white eye, or maybe another white patch on the front. But all right, so we're getting more information, and we're also feeding more to Merlin. So let's try one more time. Let's zoom in even further, right? Here's a really grainy, shoddy photo. Let's be honest, once you've zoomed in this far. And let's also be honest, this is what a lot of our photos are going to look like when we're trying to catch that bird that's flying away from us. So let's think about this. One, we can zoom in, and even with our own eyes, even if we just look at our own photos really, really grainy, we can start to say, hey, I don't even actually need Merlin. Check this out. I know that it's most likely a Scotter because we're in the ocean. It's a larger duck. It's a diving duck. And for folks who weren't with us for part 2, the cues for that is that diving ducks, they sit lower in the water. They tend to be more monochromatic, more like zebras, black and white. Especially sea ducks, they've got those bigger faces because they're fishers, right? They're not just eating aquatic plants and insects. They're going after bigger things. They need to have bigger mouths. But really, we can see that it's not the black scoter because that one, we're missing some of the white colors. And we don't see any of that white mark for the white wing scoter. And look at whose nice face that matches now that we can actually get a look at it. Ooh, we've got a surf scoter. And now that we've gotten a better zoomed in version, what we can give it to Merlin is that Merlin gets it down to the same number of guesses, right? So now it's still up to you to decide what it is that you're seeing and to do your own pattern recognition. And also, in this case, if it was a harder one, the actual one we zoomed in on, then zoom in on multiple birds if you can. And then you'll be able to figure out, is this a white wing? Is this a surf? It's starting to build some of those fun puzzle skills. All right. Where does that get us to? Oh, yes, right? So we were talking before about place and time, just reaffirming why that's so important. So when you go look at the surf scoter in Merlin, it gives you that bar, right? And just a reminder that tells you presence absence, so that there's more of them in this region of BC, which is where I'm calling home these days, in the wintertime than there is in the summer. Why is that? It's because our breeding pairs fly north to breed in the summertime, and so that means that in this time of year, there are fewer of them here. It's only the non-breeding ones that are still hanging out down in the south where there's less food. And then in the wintertime, everybody comes back to escape the harsh cold. All right. We're doing it. We're doing the things. We've made it through photos. All right. We are going to finally make our way into sound, which is arguably the coolest freaking feature about Merlin. I cannot believe that they figured this out. This blows my mind. So when they started this in 2021, when they started the sound portion of Merlin back in 2021, so just to give some perspective, like the feature that this provides is really new. 3 years is not that long for this to be made. And also the fact that it's free and commonplace is just like mind blowing. But anyways, when they first opened this feature back up in the day, there were 400 bird species. Now they're able to sound recognize over 1,300, which is pretty powerful. So I'm going to roll us back in time to last week when I was doing some field work. This is my other day job, everybody. I spend a lot of time roaming around under bridges, on rivers, and I measure the flow of the water. Not that really matters too much. Although as a fun aside, if you can see it, that stick that I've got that I'm about to go pick up and measure the flow of the water with is terribly expensive. So that's the only thing that's fancy about this. That stick is worth, I think, more than I am for a year. Anyways, not the point. Point was, as I was supposed to be doing my work, I could hear some birds chirping, and I stopped doing my work, and I stopped because I wanted to listen, right? So when you press that sound feature, it's going to open up a recording. And this is what you're going to see. At the top, it shows you a spectrogram, which is a visualization of the sound waves that you're hearing. So those dark lines, and you can see some of the repeating patterns. My mouse will flow in here. You can see some of the calls going through here. And as those calls come in, and you're able to hear, and the phone is able to hear them, then the species that it's hearing are going to start popping up as options within the recording that you're hearing. So I don't know about anyone else, but I think it is so cool to see sound, right? To have a visual in real time to the sounds that you're hearing and to cue it up. Now, the next level part about this that's really cool is that it highlights the species. So whatever one is talking at the time, you're going to see that species highlight. So you can actually start to hear and visually identify the matching sound wave. And what you still need to be looking for is trying to see the bird, right? Because then you can tie in all of those senses together. there's going to be times where you're never going to see the bird. You're just going to hear it. And that's also why this is probably the hardest, but I would say the most rewarding part of birding, is that we're such a visual species that we're not we're not as audio dependent. I know there's some musically trained people out there who have amazing hearing, and I bet birding, it's got to be such a cool experience for them to be dialed in on that. I definitely do not. So it's a lot of work for me to stop being visual and to listen. And so it's a bit of a bridge if I can see the sound and cue it with a reaction and then cue it with the bird. So when I was listening to these red-breasted nuthatches, it was so much fun to hear them, see their voices visually, and then to finally find them in the woods and see them singing and putting it all together. So being able to see the sound, I thought was really, really cool. And then when I started digging into how it is that the Merlin app does this, I laughed because people have been trying to automate a way to track sounds for a really long time. Like when I say this is as new as 2021, there's a reason it's that new, because trying to get individual sounds out of all those layers is really, really hard, right? And so what they figured out was that the way that Merlin actually identifies the birds you're hearing, it's not audio. Exactly what I said. It takes the sound, puts it onto the spectrogram so that it's a visual, and then it actually matches the visual patterns, right? So when we look at those calls, what we're seeing is a visualization of the amplitude, of the pitch, or the frequency, and then the duration of the sound. And those are unique to the calls that the bird makes, right? And so what they've been able to do with machine learning is they've been able to put in these visuals in the same way that it pattern recognized the shape of that northern pintail, it pattern recognizes the shape of the call of the northern pintail and then feeds that information back to you as the user. So this is just so cool, so mind-blowing. Behind the scenes, the way they do this is they set a quality control standard that they have to have at least 100 calls or vocalizations for each species before they make it available. Some birds have way more. Some have thousands of calls that are fed into the machine learning so that we can understand which ones, and then get fed into those bird packs that we download so that we can access them. And then I think just another way to loop in how cool citizen science feeds all of this. So it's the volunteers went through and trimmed those calls by hand, like the hundreds and thousands of calls of the thousands of species that it's taken to get all these vocalizations in. It was citizen scientist volunteers who went in, did the work, and then fed it back into the machine. So just another reason why Merlin is so cool is that there's so many ways that you get to loop back into, you get to use the tool, you get to improve the tool, you get to be part of the ones who help shape it and form it. Which really, I think that's really what all science should be, is it should be something that you can contribute to and receive from. All right, so back to what we would see, right? So when we open up, once we've made the recording, or sorry, actually in this case, the recording is still happening live, right? So the things you have to give it when you do that initial sound is you have to tell it where you are. You don't have to be necessarily super specific. You can kind of do an area if you need to, but it's time of day, or sorry, time and date, so that they know, right? This is, again, it's about narrowing down. There's thousands of birds on that app, but once you know a region, they can know which ones to expect during that time of year. And then as you listen, it'll start to show you all the different species coming in. And just one thing I want to point out is that some birds have really similar calls, songs, vocalizations, right? From bird to bird, they sound very, very similar, or at least to us they do, right? Whereas other birds have really, really unique calls. So even Merlin has to have a little bit of extra effort for birds that have more specialized calls, right? Or they're more unique to each feature, right? In the same way that we have a name that identifies us, dolphins have a squeak that identifies us, there's lots of songbirds that have an individual call. So how in the world does Merlin work on birds like that versus something like a red-breasted nuthatcher, which has a very similar call, throughout the whole species? Well, we're going to use the red-breasted oriole as an example. So again, if you wanted to go into the Explore feature, kind of a fun thing is that orioles are fun and complicated. This is, again, one of my red flags or beefs that I would red flags that I would wave or beefs that I have with birding is that names of birds are terribly confusing, especially when we think which ones should belong to which group. So in old world, so like pre-North American contact, orioles are one species of bird. And then when settlers came to North America and they saw these other birds that were also yellow and red and orange, like, oh, these must also be orioles. Joke's on us. Genetics shows that they're not related to the orioles of European ancestry or African, but they are a different one. They actually are more closely related to blackbirds and meadowlarks. And so, is an oriole an oriole? Well, kind of. But thankfully, at least, we're just going to bound what we're talking about today by North America, and hopefully we will all survive the sanity of that. So, orioles, specifically the Baltimore oriole, it got its name because it had the same colors of the crest of the Baltimore family. Oh, how very nice. I'm sure that the bird was thinking about that when they gave it its name. It's hard to ask a bird, though, what the bird would like to be named. So fair enough. It has to be given some sort of name. Now, the Baltimore oriole has almost unique calls for every single one because we believe that their calls are partially learned. So in the same way that some birds are born knowing how to build a nest and their parents never show them, right? Lots of bird calls, they are born completely knowing how to make their specific call. They don't have to learn it. But they found that there's a few studies done when they hand raised orioles away from the wild population, their call was a single note. It didn't sound anything like the wild species. And then once the breeding season came, they did develop a breeding song, but it was nowhere near what would be considered a song in the wild. So just for fun here, so it's a pretty relatively complex call, and so they let it go through one more time. And so they found that because they were able to invent their own song, they do have an innate ability they carry genetically their own, but they actually do inherit it from their surroundings. So when they hear other birds, they mimic them and then reiterate them. So they're kind of like rappers in that way. The Baltimore oriole is the rapping bird of the East Coast, where they like to riff off of each other and then learn more complex songs. So that's pretty cool. So how does Merlin contend with that? Well, the plus side is that because we have so many citizen scientists out there, we need to have more calls in the tank, so to speak, in order to identify it. So while something like a red-breasted nuthatch might only need 100 recordings to be able to identify out in the field, the oriole, on the other hand, needs probably a couple thousand, right? In order for the machine learning to try and account for as many of those variations as possible. And also sometimes it just might not get it right, same as what we were doing with the photos. Doesn't always get it out. Okay, so when we think about bird songs, they're beautiful, they're complicated, some of them are learned, some of them are genetically passed down, and they're all just kind of tricky, right? So how do we keep them straight? How are we supposed to learn them? And I'm not gonna lie, I think I said it, it's the most rewarding, but this is also arguably the most frustrating part. And I don't mean the bird calls themselves, I mean interpreting other humans' interpretation of what a bird call sounds like. And what I mean by that is the choice of I always have to do this slow motion because my tongue trips on it. Mnemonics. Oh, now I can't do it. Mnemonics. There we go. Right, so shorthand ways or phrases that help us remember things that are complex, right? In the birding world, they usually have these funny sayings. And those are actually, I can kind of handle those, right? Different birds, when you listen to them, it sounds like I'm saying, I'm so lazy, if you're a black-throated blue warbler. And so, oops, there we go. And maybe the musically trained folks are better off than I am, but I have such a hard time with this because what someone else hears as I'm so lazy, I hear as da-da-da-day. I don't know. Whenever I read these, it doesn't cue into my head, oh, that's what that sound is. I guess the one exception I can say, and here's a big list of them, right? Like the Acadian flycatcher is beat-see, beat-soo, and maybe it does, but like, again, it's just, Someone else's interpretation of the sound, I have a hard time remembering. Although I do like that someone here just wrote the American black duck is a quack, quack, quack. The one I will say is true. I grew up in a place that was named after the killdeer bird, and I will say that those ones at least do kind of sound like killdeer, killdeer. I could get behind with that one. And those are actually little shore birds. If anyone was curious what a killdeer is. One of the mnemonics that I made up as a kid was for the western meadowlark. Because when I was little, I thought it sounded like the bird was saying chip chip chips ahoy, chip chip chips ahoy. And what's funny now is I hadn't really thought about that mnemonic since I was little, and I've gone back and listened to a western meadowlark now, and my own phrase, my own saying that I used to remember it, doesn't make any sense to me anymore. That's a western meadowlark. That recording's coming in from North Dakota. So whether or not you use someone else's who's already existing or you use your own, and for some people this trick will be super helpful, and for some people it just seems overwhelming, because that's how I definitely felt when I started trying to look at other people's phrases. So think about it as an offering. It's a take it or leave it use. And then just a cool thing about western meadowlarks versus eastern meadowlarks before I move on, it's a really cool process of speciation. And so if you look at these birds, they look pretty darn identical, right? So looks wise, size wise, they seem like they should still be the same species. And if we look at them range or distribution wise, they certainly overlap. The western goes all the way over to the Great Lakes, and the eastern goes past, getting closer to the Midwest. But even though they overlap, they don't interbreed. The reason is because their songs have evolved differently. So imagine it's the spring breeding time, and someone is serenading you in a language you don't understand. So I'm going to play the western one more time, and then I'm going to play the eastern one. So there's the western one. It's got that kind of, well, I won't prelude it. This is the eastern, right? So the western one keeps building, and the eastern one builds and then falls off. Or maybe they were lazier singers, or they were going for a different note, right? So they're attracted to different sounds. It's a really cool way just how vocalization can cause species to change. Okay, and just one last comment about mnemonics before we move along is that this is a part where it's your own game, make it up, practice, patience, take the time, make funny jokes of it if you can, that always helps. But here's one funny thing I think to be aware of is that if you use a phrase and that's what you train yourself to listen for, instead of walking through the forest and hearing a bunch of nice lilts and tweets and whatnot, you're going to walk through the forest and you're going to have to untrain yourself from hearing ink ink cheeseburger, listen I'm singing, nah, 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 nah. It actually turns into those a little bit. So you have to train yourself up and then also untrain yourself out of it if you still want to have peaceful walks in the woods. There we go. So don't say I didn't forewarn you. Okay, let's go back to me being skirting out on work last week and spending time listening to birds rather than measuring rivers. So you press play, and then after you press stop, the recording saves to your phone. If you want to look at it right away, you can. If not, you can go back to the main screen and you can just hit My Sound Recordings. Either way is fine, in case you don't have time in the moment or something else is happening. But once you're in your recordings, you pick on one, and so you can play the recording that you've just made. So that's going to be that spectrogram, that visualization of the sound waves at the bottom. And you can also play, what you're seeing below there is a list of different songs. So it's a chance for you to start training your ears now to say, here's the sounds I heard, and here's what I know the species sounds like, right? We're getting closer and closer to making a positive identification, which is pretty exciting. So when we're thinking about our little red-breasted nuthatch friend here, I'm just going to pull one up for us. Again. Nope, not a sapsucker, a nuthatch. All right, so let's listen to that New York sound. If you remember the mnemonic from the page before, it was ink, ink, ink. Let's see, does anyone else think this sounds like ink, ink, ink? Maybe? I don't know. It sounds more like a car horn to me, but either way. The point is that you can start hearing it, right? And then once you can hear it, you can track it, and then hopefully you can find it in wherever you're at, whether you're in the woods or walking through the grass. An important thing with bird identification, though, is that for it to be a valuable identification, not to just for yourself or someone else, it doesn't have to be visual ID. Actually, a lot of bird surveys happen in the world, and they happen completely via audio. You don't have to always find the bird visually to confirm its identification. So that's the point of training up this skill. Not only is it like a fun, different skill set, but you can become even solely reliant on it. So kind of a cool thing to build towards. While we're on the red-breasted nuthatch, I had to find out, I was like, why in the world is this bird called a nuthatch? Well, it turns out that the reason why is because it is a, what's the corruption? Like, technically, that's the right way to say it. It's a linguistic corruption of nuthack. And that's because these groups of birds, what they would do, they'll eat lots of things. They eat insects, flying or, pecking at them on the ground or on trees. But they will also take a nut, and then they'll sort of ram it into the cracks of a tree bark, and then so that it's holding still, then they'll peck at it and hack it apart. So they used to be called nuthacks, and then over time, language rolled it into a softer sound of nuthatch. But that's where the name comes, if you're ever wondering. And another cool thing about them, this is the thing, there's something cool about everybody once you start looking for it, is that, so when they're building their nest, the males and the females both contribute to building their nest. They will dig a cavity into a rotten tree. But the unique thing about them is that they then go and they take pine or resin, pitch or resin, right? The sap that's sticky on the outside of other trees. They take that with their bills, and that's what this picture is trying to highlight here, is he's not holding a dead insect. He's actually holding a twig, and it's one of the really cool examples of tool use, because he doesn't want to get his bill all sticky. So he goes and he gets some sap from a different tree, and then he dots the outside of it. And the female does the same thing. She dots the inside of the entrance that you have to go through, and they cover the whole thing with sap so that it's really sticky and uncomfortable. And we think it's a predation response so that no one else wants to go into their little home. And for themselves, they do like a full-on James Bond landing into their holes. They don't touch anything when they go in. They go straight through, which is kind of cool, I think. But let's say you've been out there, you've heard your nuthatch, ink, 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 maybe, and then you haven't even see it. But either way, you're at the point where you're like, hey, I saw a nuthatch. It was small, it was cute, and it was energetic. I love that that's the description of this. And as another fun thing, cute is a legitimate birding term. It means to have rounder features related to cuteness. So you can use cute. It is a real biological term to define something. So you found yourself a small, cute, energetic nuthatch. You have identified it as a red-breasted. Now this is your chance to contribute back to the science that is driving this app. So when you say this is, I'll go back. At the bottom it says, this is my bird. Once you've identified it, you're going to click, yeah, that's my bird. That's the bird I saw. That's the bird I heard, right? And when you've done that, you have two options. You can save it within Merlin, or you can save it to another thing called eBird. And I brought this up very briefly at the beginning. So Merlin is this amazing, accessible app that allows you to identify the birds. It's not actually the database that feeds all of this. So we want to choose eBird. You're still welcome to choose Merlin. You're still welcome to save things in it. But my request of you is, if you're going to start on this birding journey, is to be a contributor, is to contribute, is to do the work back for this community that's helping you learn so much faster than if we would have even tried to learn ourselves 5 years ago. And so the difference is that eBird is the database, Merlin is the tool. So we want you to save your observations into the database so it can start feeding those thousands and thousands of observations that we need, right? So what's going to happen is, once you're at that point, you could either do it at home on your own computer, but you can just download another app. So click on Take Me to eBird. It'll have all the same account information, so you don't have to log in again or make a new account. You use the same one from your Merlin account. You're going to log into there, and then what you're going to do is you're going to start what's called a checklist. So this is that first screen. It's whatever day you're at. You can start the time. You could do all this post, but it's more fun to do it while you're actually out walking around. You're going to hit start. And then from that location, you can add the birds that you've seen. And you can do this, you see a few, you can do it right away. You could do a quick 10, 20-minute walk. This is actually how a lot of bird surveys work. They have to do with time. That's how they figure out species duration and some other stuff. You're going to enter the birds that you've heard, how many you think you've heard or seen, and then you're going to save it. And then you can even link it back to other locations of people that are nearby, which is kind of cool to see other birds that have popped up. And then what will eventually happen is you'll accumulate these checklists. You need to submit your checklist to eBird, and that's going to send that information back out. Now, the next level that I think is super cool about this is that you can also send your audio clips back and photos if you're doing good enough to get a sweet shot of one. By all means, you can actually, so you can click on your checklist. In each one of those, it'll tell you your information. And then what you're going to want to do is you want to say add media. Now, this is the part where I'm going to say you can go from like levels of citizen science. The first level is just submitting your checklist back in. It doesn't require too much training. Really, it's just the bird. You're just learning to hear the birds, learning to see them, identify them is enough for you to contribute to that level. If you want to contribute to the next level of citizen science, is you want to contribute those audio clips. But as someone who runs a citizen science project in my own work, a little bit of work from everybody is a whole lot of work saved for the person analyzing the data on the other side. And I'm 100% speaking from personal experience here with the amount of data control that I have to work. So in order to submit a useful and helpful clip, it doesn't take a lot of work, but you need to trim it, just like those original volunteers that created this data set. So what you'll need to do is you can go into your own phone, you can make the file a little bit smaller because you want to hear the beginning of the call and the end of the call, or at least the beginning duration of the end. Or, if you've got a truck noise in the background, try and get rid of that. Because the cleaner it is that it goes to them, the more likely they'll be able to use it. And so it makes a huge difference, right? It's not just about finding rare species. Even common species provide a huge amount of value, right? So eBird is being used to track the status and trends of species all over the world. There's some really, really cool studies going on in North America. Don't have time to really dig into a lot of them, but just like a fun example was the common loon. They tracked, so what's the word I'm looking for? You guys don't call it DFO, you call it the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. So the Washington Department of Fisheries and Wildlife use their data combined with the eBird data to figure out what the population of common loons was in their state. So how cool is that, right? It's a bird that you would see regularly. It doesn't have to be, this big, exciting, rare, I don't even know what. I mean, nothing comes to mind right now. It's kind of funny. Birds of paradise, but that's not on our continent, right? Even seeing crows, right? It's sort of a funny one, but think about how climate change is causing ecosystems to shift northward, right? Like even just documenting some of those shifts. Or having ravens come down and having these things change, right? The way that we can look back and know change is happening and make choices about the changes we're doing is if we have the data to support it. And also, as a quick aside, the data is really just numbers. It's something that we can all agree upon, right? So if the community creates it and the community is willing to support it, then that's the agreement that we're all settling on, that the work that we've all done, we believe is good enough to make sound decisions on. And this is what it comes to show us, right? This is the map distribution of common loons in times of year. And we can actually start to piece together some of these bigger trends, which is pretty amazing, pretty powerful. So we're almost out of time. I just want to go back. This is the sign that you're becoming a birder. So here I am at work. I stopped for just a minute because I was curious about the 2 or 3 birds I could hear. And if you're someone who's going to start going for birding walks, you're going to notice how birding walks are different from your normal walks. You're not going to get very far. Because what did I do? I stopped, I listened, I maybe walked another 20 feet. I heard a new bird. So I stopped and I listened. And then I walked another 20 feet. And then I heard a new bird. So then I stopped and I listened. And this is always the trick. Once you start having some nerdy bio friends, you have to accept that there are 2 types of walks. There are the walks to go for a walk. And there are walks to look at things and hear things and see things. And it's a whole different experience. So just make sure that as you all become birders and you start that journey, that you agree going out with your friends, what type of walk you're going on, because otherwise it's very easy. It's very easy to have some slight disagreements. So we're coming to a close. I'll probably leave Merlin. I'll bring Merlin in here and there as we continue the birding series, just for kind of some cool supports, different sounds, different ID things like that. But more or less, we've covered everything that Merlin has, except for a couple features. We haven't gone into the life list, which is if you're going to keep track of your own birds. Remember, that keeps it private. So if you do track it, your life list in Merlin, that doesn't feed into the community science. So my suggestion is please use eBird. Please be part of the good work that's happening. And then lastly, the feature that I think people most hear about is the step-by-step. And I didn't talk about that, partially because I think I had to leave something fun for you to figure out on your own, and partially because it uses all of the things that we've been building up to. So I believe you completely have the skill set to carry that forward all on your own. And I will pass that back to Rob, realizing we're just about at the hour there.
All right, thank you so much, Kristina. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. So, can you explain to us how to get to eBird? Is that part of the Merlin program, or is it
Yeah,
separate?
it's a completely separate app. So yeah, thanks for clarifying that one. In the same way that you just can go to your app store or whether Android, and type in Merlin and download that app, you can also download eBird the same way. It'll be a separate app, and when you click on that link in Merlin, it will automatically send you there. So don't worry about trying to connect it on your own. You can always start an eBird on your own. You don't have to start in Merlin, but eBird doesn't help you figure out what bird, right? So if you already know you saw 7 robins, then you can directly put that into eBird on its own. But if you're building those skills, you want to start working in Merlin and then transfer over to eBird afterwards.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. So, can Merlin's audio search area be expanded, just in case we think we're getting too narrow a search area?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, if you think that you are like, if you think that it's picking species that aren't there, it can. What's the right way to say this? If you're doing it by audio and not by the step-by-step guide, audio will pick up any sound it has, even if it's not in the geographic range. So if you do have a visitor that's, if you've got a flamingo in Maine, I don't know, right? As long as it has the audio clip, it will still search for it. So don't worry about the audio clip being bounded. Only worry about that when you're doing the step-by-step identification, because that one is going to hone in on your range. It's not going to have that extra information of the audio clip itself. So yeah, Merlin won't minimize your search range for audio. It'll only do it if you're doing it in the step-by-step identification.
So, do I need to be connected to the internet to use Merlin's photo or sound identification? And if so, will it remember those sounds for when I get connected?
Yeah, you don't. That's also what's so amazing about this. So those bird packs that I talked about, they do take up a bit of space on your phone, but it's not a huge amount. But that's how come you need to download those first. Then you're completely independent from being in Wi-Fi or having cell service. And it will save the recordings to your phone. So that's another thing to remember. On that landing page, there's kind of the 3 big icons, and underneath of it says, these are my recordings. So it will save them. It will keep them for you. It also means it is record. So if you make a bunch of them, it is good to kind of go in and delete the ones that you're not using, just in case you're trying to manage storage on your phone. Or if you accidentally have a recording on for an hour, that's a lot of audio. But yes, you'll be able to find it afterwards, and you can also, those are the audio clips then that you can actually send back to eBird to be used by other people in the future. So it can all loop on itself, definitely.
So, can Merlin distinguish between a mockingbird and the bird that it's mocking?
I don't know, and I love that someone thought of that. I don't know. That's I'm gonna go play with the Mockingbird songs and see what happens now. There's a challenge for everybody. Let's go see what we can find out with the Mockingbird, and then leave a comment on it when we come back to the next one.
All right, sounds good. So just to clarify, during the presentation, you were showing a lot of screenshots from the Merlin app itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, I wanted to do it from my phone just so you guys could see actually what it looked like.
Great. No, we really do appreciate that. So what happens if Merlin can't identify a sound? Is it something maybe with the recording, or it just doesn't have the knowledge base? Do we know why
Yeah,
that
so
can happen?
yeah, conflicting sounds, right? So if you're getting multiple calls at the same time, right? Think about that imagery, right? It means like you're blurring the painting, so that can be part of it if you've got too many at the same time. Also, quality of sound, kind of like what you were thinking. The further away, right? Like, well, we may be able to hear it, so getting, if you can get closer to a sound. And then also always remember at the end of the day, it is not an actual wizard. It is a machine learning program, which means that the way machine learning works and the way that a lot of AI works, like it's not real creativity, right? It's using repeated patterns. And so there are only so many patterns it can predict. And sometimes you're just going to have a natural pattern that's outside of its programming. It's not going to happen very often, right? The same way that the more data that you give it, the more accurate it is. And we've only been giving it more and more data over these years, right? This is kind of paralleling a lot of topics as AI becomes more and more common, right? And so always remember that AI is only as smart as whatever you've given it.
Great. Thanks for that advice, Christina. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you, everyone, for continuing our birding journey together. And I will be heading off to polar bear season here in about a month, but I think I've got one more scheduled early October. I think it's either the 3rd or the 4th. So we're going to do one more birding webinar before I go. Then I promise we're going to keep this train rolling when I come back. I've got some fun birding ideas kicking around. As winter comes in, winter is not a time to stop birding. There's still lots of birds in winter. So fear not. And yeah, take care of yourselves as fall rolls in. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Rob. Thanks everyone for the time.
Christina, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on the website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.